And he just mentioned that I've just come back from Tacoma, where I was called as an expert witness at this trial where these 5 people, including a nun and 2 priests, broke into a U.S. Navy Trident nuclear submarine base, and I almost fell off my chair.
That's the voice of Helen Young, Emmy Award-winning writer and producer who created the independent documentary The Nuns, the Priests, and the Bombs. She's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Tom Kalina and Michelle Dover.
Thanks, Lauren, and welcome back to Press the Button. We have now firmly entered the holiday season here. A happy Hanukkah to all of those who celebrate. Tom, we just had Thanksgiving here in the U.S. What's your favorite Thanksgiving food? Mine is the stuffing.
Hey, Michelle. Happy Thanksgiving, happy Hanukkah to you and everyone. I'm a traditionalist when it comes to Thanksgiving food, I have to say. So turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes. That makes the meal. Anything else that comes with it is just, a bonus. But it was, I had a great time. I had the kids home for Thanksgiving, which was the highlight of my Thanksgiving. The food is kind of secondary, but it was a lot of fun. And now turning to nuclear news. As our listeners know, in Vienna, the 7th round of talks on the Iran nuclear deal have just begun as we're recording this on Monday morning, November 29th. President Trump, again, as our listeners know, abandoned the deal in 2018, and the Biden administration has been trying to put the pieces back together. It's been 5 months since the last negotiations took place, and that delay was caused by the new hardline government in Iran. And with Iran ramping up its nuclear program, time may be running out for the deal. So this is an important moment. So here to help us understand what's going on is our policy analyst, Desiree Cepetis, to give us the highlights. Desiree, welcome, and tell us what we should be looking out for.
Thanks, Tom. I think the biggest thing overall to look out for is any talk of the likelihood and/or timing of an 8th round of negotiations. This is because the longer of a delay between rounds, the increased likelihood of a breakdown of talks, and the decreased likelihood of a return to the Iran nuclear deal. That being said, if no mention of an 8th round is made, folks should look out for any talk of an interim deal between the US and Iran that was rumored a couple weeks ago. Finally, folks should also look out for any talk of guarantees on the US side or sanctions relief on the US side, which is what the Iranians are looking out for.
Thank you, Desiree. We'll be on the lookout for those key negotiating parts of the deal. And getting on with the rest of the show, with Thanksgiving last week on today's episode, we will not have an early warning segment. But we do have a terrific interview. And Michelle, give us a preview of that.
So for the interview today, I sit down with Helen Young, a producer, and has a long history working in a variety of media outlets, award-winning, to sit down to discuss her film, The Nuns, the Priests, and the Bombs. We discuss the life and the work of Sister Megan Rice and the Plowshares movement. For those who aren't familiar, the Plowshares movement is an anti-nuclear weapons and Christian pacifist movement that advocates active, non-violent resistance to war. So Sister Megan Rice was one of the members of the group, and this group was the one that broke into the Y-12 national security complex, where the U.S. processes and stores highly enriched uranium. You might remember that back in 2012, and the film covers the story of that. I should clarify that the Plowshares movement is not connected to us here at Plowshares Fund, though we both work on nuclear weapons issues. This is a fascinating look at activism against the bomb, so I really hope you listen in.
And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us make the show better. And with that, let's get into the episode. The clock is ticking.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Fisk, Deputy Director of Development at Plowshares Fund and a Press the Button listener. When I first joined Plowshares Fund back in 2018, I didn't know anything about nuclear weapons. I came here with just the motivation to help create a safer world and a commitment to lifelong learning. My colleagues told me they'd teach me everything I need to know, and did they ever? Still do, actually. As I continue to grow ever more committed to Plowshares Fund and the reduction and elimination of nuclear weapons, I found that I rely on Press the Button so much. It's a resource for the latest analysis and a place where I can drop in fully, without distractions, and gain new insight into this issue I've come to know and love. I find inspiration from the weekly guests and our partners, and I know I'm a better contributor to our cause just by tuning in. Please consider supporting Plowshares Fund and helping make Press the Button possible by making a donation today. Or make it a holiday gift and send one of our festive e-cards to someone in your life who is also passionate about the pursuit of a safe and secure future. Visit plowshares.org/donate today. And thanks for listening.
Helen Young is an Emmy Award-winning writer and producer committed to illuminating critical issues of the day. She spent over 25 years working as a staff writer and producer on a number of network news and magazine broadcasts. And you might have seen her work with the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather, Dateline NBC, CBS This Morning with Harry Smith and Paula Zahn, Street Stories with Ed Bradley, and America Tonight. She has won 1 National Emmy Award and 3 New York Emmy Awards for her work, as well as awards from the Society of Professional Journalists, United Press International, the National Commission on Working Women, and the Red Cross. She wrote, directed, and produced The Nuns, the Priests, and the Bombs, an independent documentary that examines security surrounding America's nuclear weapons facility in the wake of 2 high-profile breaches. Helen, welcome to the show.
It is so great to be with you. Thank you so much for having me on.
The pleasure is all ours. So I wanted to talk to you more about this documentary, especially in light of last month, Sister Megan Rice, who's featured in the film, a prominent nuclear weapons abolitionist, passed away at the age of 91. And your documentary focuses heavily on her work. How did you meet her, and what do you remember most about her?
Well, it's a very interesting story in how I met Sister Megan. Actually, I started making this film in documenting Plowshares action. We could talk about Plowshares, of course, a protest incident that happened out on the West Coast where 5 activists trespassed onto a U.S. Navy Trident nuclear submarine base. They did it in 2009. I started working on the film about 2 years after that. And so I was working on this film and kind of telling the story of what happened, how these 5 people had broken in. It was a 84-year-old nun in that particular instance, 2 priests, one of whom was 82 years old with a heart condition, and 2 grandmothers. And these people were able to essentially gain access to one of the most allegedly top secret and secure facilities in the United States. About a year into making the film, I'll never forget this, but one Saturday morning, a friend of mine called and said, "Have you seen the front page of the New York Times today?" And I said, "No, I haven't." And she said, "I think your nun's on the front page." And I'm like, what? There goes my film. I had been working with Sister Anne Montgomery, who did the action out on the West Coast. So I thought, okay, maybe Anne Montgomery's on the front page of the New York Times. I ran to the newspaper and there was Sister Megan Rice on the front page. And I thought, what is this? And it was another Plowshares action that had just taken place at the Y-12 National Security Complex in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. I was completely flabbergasted and I thought, how did this happen? How come I didn't know about it? I've been working on the story for a year now. And as it turns out, Sister Megan Rice and the other Catholic nun who was involved in the incident on the West Coast were friends. And they had discussed, another Plowshares action to follow the one on the West Coast. So immediately I made contact with Sister Megan, and, the rest, I guess, is history, because what had happened with the incident that Sister Megan and her 2 fellow peace activists engaged in, Michael Wally and Greg Borgiobet out at Y-12, that incident got so much publicity. I mean, it triggered 4 congressional hearings as lawmakers tried to look into, how could something like this happen? How could such a serious security breach happen? My understanding that was that even Stephen Chu, the Secretary of Energy at the time, was informed, because, after all, Y-12 is where the United States stores the bulk of its highly enriched uranium. And my understanding is that even some countries like Kazakhstan that have gotten rid of their HEU have sent it to Y-12 for safekeeping. So here you have, Sister Megan Rice in her 80s. These people were able to get in with basically with a pair of bolt cutters, and of course, driven by their deep conviction. And so, Michelle, to just tell you, my experience in making the film is just getting to know these people and getting to know the depth of their conviction and their real concern for humanity. It is really what drives them. So anyway, regarding Sister Megan, I developed a great relationship with her. I came to know her, and I was really heartbroken, when she passed away. The last conversation I had with her, she was suffering from congestive heart failure. And I asked her how she was doing. Her breathing was kind of labored. And she said to me, "Helen, I am very blessed." And she's just a remarkable person.
I completely agree. And now, just for podcast listeners, I want to clarify that Plowshares Fund is actually not the same as the Plowshares movement. So during this episode, you'll hear us talk about the Plowshares movement and the Plowshares action, and that's a separate network. Though, of course, both include the biblical reference from Isaiah that nations shall beat their swords into plowshares. The Plowshares movement is an anti-nuclear weapons, largely Christian Catholic pacifist movement. It's been in existence since the early 1980s, and it often practices civil disobedience to bring attention to the horror of nuclear weapons. And so, going back to this break-in at Y-12, at the time I was actually working for the Department of Energy. And so I remember watching the congressional oversight hearings and hearing the conversations in the building. They were almost entirely focused on exactly as you were talking about the nature of these security breaches, what it meant in terms of the U.S.'s credibility to other nations, what it meant in terms of, did it leave open the possibility for nuclear terrorism? And almost no attention was paid to the reasons that the activists committed the actions in the first place. So as you were investigating this story, telling this story, how did you reconcile this almost split understanding of what actually took place?
Well, it's interesting, Michelle, that you bring this up because, as a journalist and working in television news, we focus on what is going to get the most attention. And obviously, the fact that these elderly people, this ragtag team was able to get into this highly, fortified area where millions of dollars being spent to secure it is pretty shocking. It's not something that you can, avoid talking about. And you're right. I mean, during the hearings, one lawmaker who said, when an 82-year-old pacifist nun can break into the inner sanctum of our weapons complex, we cannot say job well done, and yes, that's what they focused on. Of course, the activists were upset about that. But from my perspective, it was a great entree into telling the larger story. I think that just to backtrack a little bit, I'd thought a long time about making a film about nuclear weapons. It was a subject that interested me, but how to tell the story? You don't want to tell an issue story. You mentioned that I work for CBS News, and one of the real giants of CBS News was Don Hewitt, who created 60 Minutes. And Don Hewitt had a mantra, and his mantra was, "Tell me a story. Don't talk to me about an issue." People respond to stories about other people. They do not really respond as strongly to issues because their eyes just glaze over. It's more facts and figures. But if you can tell me a story and through that narrative, you can talk about the issue, then I think, you really can sort of get people's attention. So, from my perspective, I have to be honest, that the incident itself is dramatic enough to get people's attention. From the perspective of the activist, I remember, Sister Megan once telling me when she was, this was when she was first incarcerated, she was at the Knox County Jail. And I had several conversations with her on the phone. And she said, we got so much more attention from that action than we ever even hoped for. And so, of course, they get a lot of pushback. Like, why would you do something like this? Why would you put those poor people who are guarding the facility in jeopardy? They have the responsibility to shoot you. Why would you do that? And just as an aside, there have been 100 Plowshares actions. And there's never been a violent incident, or no one's ever gotten hurt, because when these activists do go into these facilities, they take special care to bring their peace symbols, to bring their banners, and to make it brutally obvious to whoever's there that they're peace activists. They don't have any weapons or anything like that. So from the perspective of Sister Megan, she said to me, look, it may not be the best way to raise awareness, but it's a dramatic way. And we need drama right now because people are not paying attention. And so if this is going to get people's attention, then we'll do it. And so, these are people who are willing to put themselves in that kind of a situation where let's be honest. I mean, they did enter on the West Coast, the incident that I profile in the film. They entered a shoot to kill zone where the Marines and the other people guarding that facility have the orders to shoot to kill. But of course, again, they could tell that these were elderly activists and, they did not mean any harm.
And I really appreciate how your film highlights the discipline that's needed for conducting civil disobedience in effective and impactful ways. I think that's something that can be lost in our cultural discussions that seem to see violence as the most effective means of change, and the amount of skill and discipline it takes in order to carry out nonviolent civil disobedience. Before we get into your story, because I'm really curious to hear what brought you to this issue, you mentioned that the activists who broke in were elderly. And, several of the prominent Plowshares leaders have passed away in recent years. What do you think comes next for this movement?
I think that's a very good question. And part of the reason why it's so hard to figure this out is because the actions that they take are done in secrecy. As I mentioned, when I was surprised to see that Sister Megan's action had occurred while I was making my film, and I had absolutely no notion that this was going on, it's because they don't want to involve people who might know about it and therefore get swept up in a conspiracy charge, or you knew that they were breaking in, why didn't you go tell the police or whatever? So that is, that's part of kind of the dilemma here, is you don't really know what they're planning. But I just want to follow up on something that you said about the seriousness with which they plan these actions. They pray about it for a year. They discern, and they do spend time together in contemplation of what they're about to do, and they do take it very seriously. It's not anything that they do cavalierly, and they spend a lot of time. In fact, one of the activists who has since passed away, Father Bill Bixel, who was in the action out on the West Coast, he told me that he didn't think he was going to do it. He didn't think in the beginning that he was actually had I don't know if he just had the energy because he had serious heart condition. But I think what kind of put him over the edge was the summer before he had gone to Hiroshima, and he was there and had really witnessed to where the first bomb dropped. And he said something happened to him when he was there. And he thought, okay, I am going to do this. He came back to the United States and he spent time, in discernment, and he decided to join the group. Yeah, as far as what's going to happen in the future, I know that there are many people who are involved in Plowshares. Do I know who the young people are? Not necessarily. But I mean, they did another action in 2018. They did the Kings Bay Plowshares action, where they trespassed onto the submarine base there in Kings Bay, Georgia. And, the youngest I think he was in his mid-50s, but they have people. They do. They have many supporters. I mean, just to give you an idea, when Sister Megan was in jail, in the Knoxville jail, they got 3,000 letters came in from supporters around the country. Thousands of people around the world do support them. Again, not all of us are called to do this type of work. And Sister Megan would be the first one to say, I'm a nun. I don't have a family. I don't have a husband. I don't have children. So I have the freedom to go to jail. But other people have their own unique way of participating and, being involved in this issue.
Which leads me to my question about you. You have spent years working on hugely important issues, and you could have picked so many other topics to produce a documentary on. Why did you pick this one?
Good question. So, as you mentioned, I worked in television news for many years, but I also have a background. I did study international affairs in graduate school and Russian. And I was interested in the issue for a long time, but actually, the catalyst was when I read the op ed that the Four Horsemen had written: Kissinger, Schultz, Perry, and Nunn. And they wrote a series of op-eds. I think there were 4 that they wrote. But when I read that first one, I thought, wow, this is really surprising. These men were, staunch supporters of nuclear weapons and advocates, and they are now doing a 360. What is it about the nuclear, sphere now that has made them change their mind? So I began to really kind of go back and look at what had happened to the issue since I was in graduate school. How had it changed? And really, Michelle, it was a big learning process for me because I really hadn't kept up with how many we have, how powerful the weapons are now. And the more I got into it, the more I thought, wow, now I understand what's really going on. And the Four Horsemen talked about, now with more and more countries having nuclear weapons, it's not anymore, the 2 superpowers, the US and the USSR. You have far more countries seeking them. You have non-state actors involved. And the issue became much more of interest to me. But again, I wanted to find a story. I needed to find a story. And I spent a few years actually looking for the right story. I had started working on one particular issue, and then I thought, nah, it's not working. And then, as luck would have it, one day I was having lunch with Steve Leeper, who at the time was the head of the Hiroshima Peace Culture Foundation. And we were just casually, having lunch. And he just mentioned that I've just come back from Tacoma, where I was called as an expert witness at this trial where these 5 people, including a nun and 2 priests, broke into a US Navy Trident nuclear submarine base. And I almost fell off my chair because I had been looking for a great story and this hadn't crossed my radar. I later found out that the US Navy kind of kept the lid on the story because there again, it was very embarrassing. So that's kind of how I came to the story and why.
And I'm not going to spoil the film for those who want to see it, but tell us more about how it was to produce it, how you have been sharing it, and what the reception has been.
Well, it was a challenge to make it come together. We ended up having to do a crowdsourcing campaign to raise the money for it, which was an experience in and of itself because I'd never had to do that. We were able to get the film shown actually at the United Nations. We had our debut at the United Nations while the negotiations were underway on the new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. We were sponsored by the Permanent Mission of Ireland, and it was just great. I mean, we really had, wonderful support, not only from the faith community, but for me personally, the most gratifying part of it has been that we were on a college tour with the film before COVID. And with oftentimes Sister Megan would come along because she's such a rock star. When she would be there, the students would love to hear about how could she do this? How did she break in? And what was prison like and all of that. So, yeah, I mean, I guess going back to my original reason for making it, which is because of my deep and abiding belief that this is probably the most serious security threat we're facing in the world right now. Unfortunately, not too many people are aware of it. Many young people are engaged in the climate movement, which is wonderful. But I always like to say, if there's a nuclear confrontation, we won't have a climate to protect because, it's just horrific what would happen. And so, when we were on college, we showed the film, for example, at Wellesley College at the Madeleine Albright Institute for Global Affairs, and the young women there, many of whom are going into diplomacy or international affairs. For some of them, too, it was an eye-opener on the status of our nuclear weaponry. So that's been very gratifying, to be able to let young people know about it. And Sister Megan's message is always, get involved, because people would always say to us after the filming, well, what can I do? This seems so overwhelming. What can I do? And Sister Megan would say, dearie, You can learn about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Just study about it, just read about it, become informed. And that doesn't really require any spending of any money or anything like that. It's just a matter of understanding how serious this problem is and how much we need more, people to become aware of it.
And I cannot recommend the documentary highly enough. It really was just really well done and tells a complicated story in a really just engaging way. So where can listeners go to watch the documentary and continue their journey of learning more about the issue?
So the documentary is now streaming online. You can find it on YouTube. You can find it on Amazon Prime, on iTunes. It's on Google Play. My distributor is Passion River Films. You can also go to my website, which is www.nunspriestsbombsthefilm.com. And all the information on where you can find the film is there. And I really appreciate your taking the time to let your listeners know about this film and about the people who are engaged in it and what they've been doing for the rest of us, for humanity. They're doing the heavy lifting for all of us, I feel.
I agree. Helen, it has been a pleasure to have you on. And thank you so much for joining, and best of luck in getting this film out there.
Thank you, Michelle. I do appreciate it very much.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billett and Angela Keller, and in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing and Delphine Digital, with research and assistance from Alex Hall, Harry Tarpey, and Desiree Cepetis. Audio engineering and sound design by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.